Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us this evening. So I'm Aaron Jor van Oosterhout, and I serve as a research manager at the Community Data and Research Lab at the Johnson Center for Philanthropy here at Grand Valley. I also have the honor of serving as the co-director of Grand Valley's own prison education program, and that's the Bellamy Creek campus. And I can assure you that few people's lives are as profoundly shaped by our society's belief in the supposed objectivity of data than those people who find themselves enmeshed in the criminal justice system. It is my distinct honor and pleasure to introduce someone who will shake that belief this evening. Assistant professor of the practice in data science at the School of Data Science at the University of Virginia, Renée Cummings joined the school in 2020 as the school's first data activist in residence. She is a criminologist, criminal psychologist, artificial intelligence ethicist, therapeutic jurisprudence specialist, and urban technologist. Her areas of research interests include artificial intelligence, political science, and criminology. She studies the impact of artificial intelligence on criminal justice, specifically in communities of color and incarcerated populations. In her work as a criminologist, Cummings founded Criminal Justice Intelligence Incorporated, which works with governments in the Caribbean to strengthen crime prevention, incorporate new technologies in existing crime prevention strategies, and develop behavior and hardware strategies that interlink to reduce vulnerabilities and tailor more proactive approaches to crime control and crime reduction. Cummings also founded Urban AI and is an East Coast regional leader for women in AI ethics. In her time in New York City, Cummings brought her expertise to train police officers and law enforcement agents to decrease homicides and gun and gang violence. Cummings specializes in implicit bias, AI ethics, and best practice criminal justice. She holds a Master's of Science in Rehabilitation Science and Substance Abuse Counseling from Hunter College, a Master of Arts in Criminal Justice from John Jay College, and a Master's Certificate in Terrorism Studies. Cummings designed her own bachelor's degree at Hunter College in political science, philosophy, media studies, and creative writing. Cummings is also a community scholar in artificial intelligence and criminal justice at Columbia University. It is my pleasure again to welcome Renée Cummings to the stage. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that amazing introduction. Let me say it is indeed an honor and a pleasure and my distinct privilege to be with you this evening. We are going to have a conversation about data, algorithms, artificial intelligence, and justice. And I hope somewhere along that line in that conversation, we realize the extraordinary amount of work that we've got to do as a collective when it comes to ensuring our technology that's being deployed, new and emerging technologies, are responsible, trustworthy, and always ethical. So let's begin this conversation. So the conversation is disrupting data injustice. And let's just start by thinking about something. We have seen the extraordinary impact of data science on society. Data science is considered probably the career of the now. Everyone wants to be a data scientist. And we're still trying to define what is data science? What are the roles and responsibilities of the data scientists? But we do know that we have experienced individually and collectively the positive impacts of data science. And there are many of them. But we also know that what we are realizing is as we experience what is positive and what is transformative about this amazing technology that we're designing, new and emerging technologies with data, we're realizing that there are many consequences. And what we're also realizing is that while we are solving some of the world's greatest challenges with data, we are also creating new ethical challenges that demand our real-time attention. So the big challenge, How do we harness the power of data while mitigating the risks and reducing the harms? That's what we're trying to do with data science as we try to solve some of these extraordinary challenges that we have as a world, a society, and a globe. The dilemma that we have is that data is as powerful as it is vulnerable. It is probably the most powerful thing, commodity, asset that we have to use. But as it is powerful, it is extremely vulnerable. Vulnerable to attack, to breaches, to bad actors. And these are some of the reasons why we've got to think about the ways in which we need to do technology that is justice-oriented, equitable, diverse, and inclusive. So we know that data is profit. It is big money. And we know that there are 5 big tech companies that own us, that own our data. And we also know if we've been using social media, if we've been on the internet, if we've been doing any kind of research, watching any kind of media, or doing any type of online shopping, once we have stared down a computer and clicked, we have data points. And those data points are being used to create these data profiles about us. And what none of us actually know is, what does our digital twin actually look like? And that's something we need to think about. So what we're seeing with data is knowledge. Data is intelligence. And with that intelligence and that data acumen, what we are doing is creating more access in places that we have never been, in systems and design and processes and procedures that we have not even thought about. We are using data to now create and to stretch the imagination. With access and that knowledge and that intelligence, we are creating extraordinary opportunities. And these opportunities are redesigning the business model and reimagining that business model. Because what we are seeing is that every sector, every system, every discipline, every industry is being impacted by data science, is being remodeled, reimagined, redefined, repositioned because of data. And what data allows many of the individuals who actually own that data, who are designing with that data, who are deploying these systems, would be leadership. Because that's what data is about. Who has the data is allowed to lead, and to lead in the ways in which we are thinking and the ways in which we are interacting with each other and the kinds of systems and processes and procedures we're developing. So data is also about development. So there are some great things about data. But we know that data is promise. And if it is, we are searching for this ideal, we've got to deal with the privilege. And we've got to deal with the prejudice. Because these are the dangerous things about data, and the ways in which we are using data, and the power of that data. So the politics. And there's an extraordinary amount of politics around data. It's not only a commodity. It's not only about economics, but data is cultural. Data is also political, and we're seeing data being used in the realm of global dominance, and we're also seeing it being used to expand the ways in which industries are expanding, the ways in which governments are expanding, and the ways in which tech companies are expanding in ways in which governments cannot even expand. And we're seeing the monetization of our data. But as we see the monetization of our data, what we're also seeing is the weaponization of that data, and particular communities being more vulnerable to that weaponization. And there are 2 things that I always say, is that all data are not created equally, and different communities experience data differently. And that's, when I say weaponization, what I'm thinking of there. So if we are to do data science right, we have got to think about the ways in which we have historically been collecting data, the kind of analysis around that data, the quality of the data as well, how we are using that data to visualize the kinds of challenges we have, the ways in which we're presenting that data, and the ways in which we are sharing that data. And there's something that I've realized working as a data activist and an AI ethicist, and working as a criminologist, is that many times we do not think about data and data's memory. and that data has an extraordinary memory beyond the numbers, beyond the statistics, beyond the computation. Data has an extraordinary memory when it comes to oftentimes replicating trauma, and trauma in particular communities. So we know when we think about data, it's about decision-making accuracy. That's what everyone wants. That's what data acumen is. It's about how do we make the most accurate decisions in real time to really exploit the kinds of systems that we're creating. But where there is this desire for excellence through efficiency and effectiveness, and oftentimes expediency, there's this challenge of exclusion, because what we are also seeing is that data has an extraordinary power to exclude. Because what we decide to include in our analysis of data, it means that there's some things that we have also decided to exclude. And those are some of the challenges we are seeing and that we need to think about. So we know this decision-making is about knowledge, it's about opportunity, and it's about resources. But it's also about something even more critical. It's about legacies. And what we are seeing is that there are many communities that are now being challenged to get the kinds of resources that are required to create sustainable and resilient legacies, because they no longer have access to the resources, because we're using data to decide who has access to the resources. So we're using data to decide who gets a loan, who gets particular housing, who gets a mortgage, who is determined and deemed creditworthy, who is deemed uncreditworthy. We're thinking about data as well in the criminal justice system and the ways in which historic data are really re-administering things that we thought we had in check. So when we are thinking about data science and coming from a critical data science perspective, we've got to start to think about how do we really interrogate our data sets? How do we investigate? How do we get behind the data and really understand the history, the memory, the kinds of experiences that particular communities have had that are attached to those data sets? Because what we have realized with many of the historic data sets that we have continued to use to build systems would be that many of them are deeply destructive because they continue to replicate and repeat past prejudices. As well as what we have seen is that we're using new and emerging technologies, and we're using those technologies with historic data, with old data. And what we're doing is automating the status quo. What we are also doing, as we have seen particularly in criminal justice, is that we're codifying bias and bigotry. And those are things that we don't want to do. So when we think about those hidden effects of data, we are thinking about the racial disparities. We are thinking about the economic disparities, marginalization, and of course, systemic racism. All of these baked into our data sets. So just things that I want you to think about as we move into the conversation as well about algorithms and AI. So some of the hidden effects of historical data. Many of you may have read this study that was revealed, investigative research/study that was executed by ProPublica. And what ProPublica did was look at the recidivism risk assessment tools that were being used by the criminal justice system. And what they realized is because we were using historic data was overestimating the kinds of risks of Black and brown men in the criminal justice system and creating what we call these zombie predictions, saying that particular groups were going to reoffend, and that we needed to deny particular groups bail because they were going to reoffend. And when we drilled into the data, we realized it was because of those disparities that were baked into those data sets, those hidden effects of historical data that we really don't think about, implicit bias, unconscious bias. And for us to really understand the kind of responsibility that we have as technologists, data scientists, sociologists, economists, designers, design thinkers, we have got to realize that we have got to be extremely diligent, because some of the things that we've seen, these artificial assumptions, would be that there is this view that technology is neutral because it is math, because it is science. We just believe that it is right. And what we have come to see is that no technology is neutral. We have got to continuously question the objectivity of technology because of the opaque nature of many of our data systems, many of our algorithmic systems, our data-driven and algorithmic decision-making systems, because they continue to perpetuate the biases and the disparities. So we've got to be diligent. And that diligence means that we've always got to be thinking of how do we detect, how do we mitigate, how do we manage, how do we monitor these algorithmic and data-driven systems that we're using, and how do we use that feedback and that information to continuously bring an ethical approach to the ways in which we are doing data science and doing artificial intelligence. So there's also the question of duty of care. And if we are designing technology for each other, for society, for us to use, we have a responsibility as technologists and data scientists and anyone using data, healthcare professionals, to really think about how we're doing that. So if we are to disrupt the injustices, it means that we need to take an ethical approach, one that is mature, responsible, building trustworthy technology. It means that we've continuously got to think about oversight. We've got to think about compliance. We've got to think about regulation and governance. And we have got to bring that justice-oriented and trauma-informed perspective to the ways in which we are thinking and the ways in which we are doing data science. And it's also about due process. Because what we have seen with data-driven systems and algorithmic decision-making systems would be that many times we are using data and creating systems to make decisions. And as these systems continue to make decisions, they are leaving us out of the decision-making process. So we see questions of agency and autonomy and equity and fairness and self-determination being threatened because of the fact that many of the systems we're designing without an approach that really understands how critical due process is in the design of new and emerging technology, as well as its deployment and adoption. So it brings us to the question of diversity. And we have got to think about the diversity of harms being deployed as well with this new and emerging technology. And we've got to think about the diversity in the cognitive injustices that many communities have felt and experienced because of data. We've got to think about accessibility and whether or not we are truly making technology accessible. We've got to think about representation and how critical voice and visibility are to the ways in which we represent certain groups. And how do we do that? Through multi-stakeholder engagement. It is critical because it is about community-engaged research. It's about community-engaged design. It's about really bringing the community into the process to inspire the design. And it's about the interdisciplinary imagination because we realize in data science that data science needs all of us, needs all disciplines. So we need the sociologists, the psychologists, the criminologists, just about everyone, the educators, every industry, every discipline needs to be a part of data science and needs to be a part of artificial intelligence because we're realizing diversity in thinking and in the ways in which we are doing data science and in the kinds of conversations that we're having to create the requisite level of intellectual confrontation that's required to build an ethical approach to data science. So diversity, also very critical. The challenge is that we continue as we design, as we develop, and as we deploy to have to deal with discrimination. And I come from a background of data justice. And today, I had also a very interesting conversation with design students about design justice and how critical design justice is to data science and critical data science and artificial intelligence. So racial justice, social justice, climate justice, these are all critical questions around the ways in which we need to do data ethically, because it comes down to this, democracy. If data science and using data is about data and decision-making accuracy, it's also about democracy. And what we're seeing with data science is that while it has the potential to do things that are extraordinary, and things that are transformative, it also has the potential to disenfranchise. And we have experienced disinformation, and we have experienced deep fakes. What we don't want to experience would be more deep fakes, because that is an experience we are not ready for as a society as yet. And that also speaks to data literacy and the lack of data literacy, and AI literacy and the lack of AI literacy, and futures literacy, and of course the lack of futures literacy, because this is the language in which we are now communicating data and algorithms. And a requisite level of literacy is also required to communicate with these languages, because we are seeing that an unethical approach to data science, a lack of a critical data science perspective, actually undermining and dismantling our democratic rights. So what we don't want is to use data to disempower. We don't want to undermine agency and autonomy. We don't want to compromise self-determination. And self-determination is also so critical among our First Peoples and our First Nation and our indigenous communities who are committed to thinking about data governance in new ways, who are committed to really bringing a robust and rigorous approach to data ethics through data stewardship, who are having conversations about indigenous data and the indigenous imagination, and how do we include that in the conversation? Because we are seeing the data that is deployed in unethical ways, that is used to build technologies in unethical ways, that are building unethical algorithms, have the power to encroach on our civil liberties, our civil rights, and of course our human rights. So for us to democratize this technology, which means bringing all of us into the fold, bringing all groups into the conversation, we have got to find ways in which we could demystify, we can decolonize, and we could really emancipate the data from its historic past, a past of pain, a past of trauma, a past of injustices, a past of inequalities and inequities. Because we're seeing the world moving in the direction of techno-solutionism. And techno-solutionism is simply this belief that every challenge needs a technological solution, and it doesn't. And we have realized that. And techno-determinism, where we have a very deterministic way of now looking at the world and believing technology is going to be our savior. And that's not going to happen. So we've got to think about how do we demystify, how do we decolonize, how do we emancipate for us to democratize the ways in which we are using data to ensure that we always understand why it needs to be done ethically. And it brings us to data trauma and the fact that when I mentioned to you that different communities experience data differently, we know that history, and we understand the pain of that history, and we understand if we are supposed to use data to build new and emerging technologies and to disrupt the injustices of data, then we have got to understand the trauma attached to data for many communities. So we've got to always ensure that when we do data, we are doing it in a way that is culturally aware, appropriate, competent, sensitive, and responsive. Because this is what we have seen with data trauma, data bias, data discrimination, data profiling, data weaponization, and data victimization, all critical. And I come from that space of criminal justice and criminology and policing, and ways in which we can do policing in more equitable and diverse and inclusive ways. And we could bring communities into that conversation, because we know that communities and law enforcement are co-producers in keeping a crime rate down in any space. So we have got to think about the trauma attached to that. And we have got to understand if we are using data, then we have got to use it in a critical way, which includes bringing a very responsible and mature approach to the ways in which we are thinking about technology. So of course there are the ethical risks. And the ethical risks around data would be privacy, accountability, transparency, explainability, of course fairness and non-discrimination, and security and safety. So we're coming up with ways in which we can deal with those ethical risks, because they have major ethical challenges for organizations. Many organizations have deployed ethical frameworks. Many organizations are committed, and governments committed, to doing data ethically. Most recently, the White House released the blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights, which looks at the ways in which we need to think about AI and algorithms and how they are impacting certain communities, and bring a safety approach to it. So we've got to think about rights and we've got to think about risks. Of course, we know the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation coming out of the EU, and at the moment the EU having conversations about the EU AI Act, which is supposed to be enacted very soon. So we say do no harm, and that's the big one, but we're trying. And we believe that if we are to do data ethically, and if we're to do algorithms and AI ethically, that we should do the least amount of harm possible. So we've got to create this rigorous and robust guardrail that's required to protect the ways in which we are interacting with data. Because it's about public confidence, and it's about public trust. When you combine public confidence and public trust, that's where you get legitimacy, that space of legitimacy in which we are using these technologies. And it comes back to being ethically vigilant. And ethical vigilance is critical because it means eternally, as you are using data, as you're using data to design whatever it is that you want to design or respond to, whatever those challenges are, you are understanding that ethical responsibility that you have. Because it comes down to data rights. And data rights is probably the civil rights movement of the now. Because these are the conversations we need to start having if we're not having them yet. And these are also kitchen table conversations, because we need to have them with everyone in the family, because everyone is using data, all communities. And each and every one of us in this space represents many communities. So this is why this conversation is so critical, because we're seeing data, the unethical use of data, having the extraordinary potential to do great and transformative things, but also to impact our civil rights and our human rights and, of course, our civil liberties. And we spoke about that AI Bill of Rights and the EU Act and the GDPR and how these approaches to governance and regulation and compliance are assisting us in building those robust guardrails that are required. So data rights, and we've got to think about that. So now we come to algorithms, and this is going to be a quick and real-time crash course in how we do AI and algorithms. So we know that it's a formula that provides an instruction to a computer to perform a very specific task. Some people say it's like a recipe. So you put certain ingredients in there, in a computational way, and then the computer is able to deliver what looks like a very human-like kind of response to the things that we want. So there are these algorithms, and these algorithms are continuously being designed, and we are using them. And we are using them so much, but so many of us don't know we're using them. And that's why one of the things that really interests me with the EU AI Act is the fact that the Act says, and they're looking at, maybe it's time for us to let people know they're using algorithms. So when you apply for something, a loan, or when you apply for a mortgage, or whatever it is you're using on the internet, so much, that you are able to know that this is an algorithm. So many of us use, let's say, Amazon. We're shopping. How many of us have even asked ourselves, what is Amazon choice? We see Amazon choice. We oftentimes click on it. But what is really the choice? Whose choice is that? And what's directing us to that choice? So we've got to think about that. So these algorithms, and you cannot have algorithms without data. You cannot have AI without data, because data is what we use to create these algorithms. And we have been seeing that because most people don't know they're using algorithms, because there's nothing that says an algorithm is in use here, there is no warning, that these algorithms continue to make decisions about us and for us without us even knowing. So when I spoke about agency and autonomy and self-determination, these are the challenges that algorithms are creating, because what they are doing is undermining our identity, undermining what it means sometimes and oftentimes to be a citizen. So the question is, how can we maximize the impact of algorithms, because they can have very positive and powerful impact on society and mitigate those adverse effects? And that's what we're trying to do as AI ethicists and data activists and data ethicists and individuals working in the data science space. So one of the things that I always say when we come to defining AI, it is still undefined. That's the only definition. It continues and remains to be undefined. But we know that these tasks are being done in a way that replicates human behavior. We know it requires an extraordinary amount of data. We know that it's life-changing, the kinds of decisions we see algorithms making. We also know that algorithms have the opportunity to create extraordinary legacies, but algorithms also have the opportunity to destroy legacies. And that's what we've got to think about. How do we build sustainable and resilient legacies for all? And how do we mitigate those risks of algorithms undermining those legacies? So this is Joy Buolamwini, Dr. Joy Buolamwini, and she's known as really a main thinker, main researcher within the space of algorithmic justice and algorithmic injustice. And what she realized while doing a project for MIT before she graduated with her doctorate was that she was trying to represent her face using image recognition technology, and because of her dark skin, that was impossible. She had to put a white mask on, and she realized at that moment facial recognition technology was definitely not a technology that was being used effectively for Black and brown people, and particular women as well, or anyone who identified as a woman. So she said that AI systems shaped by the priorities and prejudices, conscious and unconscious, of the people who designed them. So we've got to check ourselves as designers, as individuals working in that design space, because algorithms have created a new space for injustice. And she introduced what she called the pale male bias, because up to 77.4% of subjects in mainstream data sets are male, up to 94.6% are lighter-skinned males. And what this is creating is a dysfunctional, dangerous space for individuals of dark skin, Black and brown communities. So facial recognition. And this gentleman right here, Robert Williams, is with his family, but he was arrested because the police said they saw him in a mall shoplifting when he was not in that space, but they used facial recognition technology that was deployed in that space, and somehow it produced an image of a man, they said, that looked just like him. So he spent 15 hours incarcerated before a police officer decided to look at his ID and realize that the two pictures were not a match. But think about the trauma that his children went through because he was arrested at home in front of his family, of course in a manner that was not very polite or very civilized, and the kinds of extraordinary impacts of that. He lost his job in the process because he was on his way to work and he couldn't go to work. So we're using technology and we're deploying technology in a very capricious and cavalier manner, and we have got to think about that. So we know there are many conversations at the moment around facial technology. Some cities have decided to ban it. The EU is saying it's way too high risk to deploy, and we've got to think about not using it, so they also want to ban it. But we're seeing the positive effects of facial recognition technology in finance, in healthcare. So these are some of the questions and some of the challenges. And of course, predictive policing, where we're using data to create predictive systems that are supposed to reduce crime and criminality, but what we continue to do would be to replicate those old biases with new technology and not come up with new criminal justice strategies, but come up with strategies that continue to victimize, to track, to trace, to terrorize certain communities. And at the moment, at the University of Virginia, I'm working with some data scientists, my own team, what I call my mini lab, and we have designed what is called a digital force index. And that gives you a digital force score, because what we have done is collate all the surveillance technologies, private and public, that are being deployed in this country, and coming up with a score. So when you go into a particular community, you could know whether or not the technologies being deployed, the surveillance tech being deployed, whether they're high, whether it's medium, whether it's low, and how this technology could impact you and your future. Because there are things called geofencing and geolocation warrants, and we're realizing now, just with your phone and the data, that if your data turns up at a particular place where police may be doing an investigation, you can become a person of interest to the police in the blink of an eye. You're now part of an investigation. So we've got to think about predictive policing as well. So if we are to do responsible and trustworthy AI, then we've got to include everyone in the conversation. If we are to disrupt data injustices, we've got to bring all citizens in there. Civil society has an extraordinary impact. Stakeholders are critical because it's about public engagement. It's about public information. It's about public education to ensure we are doing technology in ways which are responsible and of course, always trustworthy. It's also about all organizations, academia, working with governments, working with regulators to really create that space that is responsible and trustworthy, because it is so critical. And when we think about data and we think about AI, we have always got to think about justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And this is a campaign from women in AI ethics. And what we try to do is show the future of AI, well, that's me there, using a variety of women, cultures, sexualities, to show that AI looks like all of us, because that's how we democratize. That's how we demystify. That's how we bring an understanding to the ways in which we're doing technology, and that's how we become inclusive, because we want to bring everyone into that space. So as powerful as data is, as powerful as algorithms are, and given the fact they have this extraordinary ability to do extraordinary things and to do really great things, we've got to think about that vulnerability. And that vulnerability, that ability to be used in ways which are unethical, have got to be very important to all of us. Because it is our data that's being used. It's our data that's being monetized. It's our data that's being weaponized. And in as much as we need data to create the kinds of technologies that continue to transform our world, our globe, and our experiences, we have got to be critical about those ways. And we have got to bring an ethical approach. And we have got to bring that ethically resilient approach. And we have got to bring an approach that is sustainable, an approach that makes sure that we are continuously vigilant about the ways in which we're doing technology. Because we need it. We need technology and we need data, but we also need all of us to experience the benefits of that. And we have got to be committed to this understanding that if we are doing technology, if we're doing AI, we are doing it for all of us. We cannot continue to just do it for some of us, because as we are using technology to remove barriers, we're also erecting new barriers with technologies. So as an AI ethicist, my focus is on fairness, accountability, transparency, and particularly auditability, and looking at privacy and security, and really thinking about ways in which we can do it. So I spend a lot of time traveling internationally, this was in Montreal, and really having these kinds of conversations about how do we do data science ethically, how do we do AI right. And as a data activist, we've got to understand that each of us is a data activist. Each of us, we have got to be responsible. We've got to be on the ball when it comes to how our data is being used. And we've got to think always about being justice-oriented and trauma-involved and informed, and ensuring that the technologies we are creating are people-powered, community-inspired, using data for change, AI for good. And I'm also the co-director of the Public Interest Technology Network at the University of Virginia, which is so critical. And many universities are part of this network because we've realized that we've got to use technology in the public interest. We've got to build technology with the public in mind. We've got to bring the public into that conversation, because this is so critical a conversation that we've got to understand the role that we play, our responsibility for us to get data right. And with that, I want to thank you very much for this opportunity, and always thanking you for the privilege of your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the presentation. So a question on your slide on do no harm. That seems like a great place to start, but is there even a good definition for that?
Fantastic.
Where would somebody start?
Fantastic. And I think we start with ourselves. And we start with that understanding that we have got to bring that requisite level of vigilance and due diligence to the ways in which we're using data and to the ways in which our data is being used. So we've got to really get involved. And you get involved in that conversation wherever you are. I always say wherever we sit, wherever we stand, we lead, because we represent so many different communities. So it's really about having those conversations. It's about ensuring that at the local government level, at a national, federal level, that we're having these conversations. We're seeing organizations moving in that direction. But even in our schools, in academia, in our classrooms, at our kitchen tables, we need to start talking about data, because the challenge, as I say to you, is yes, I'm in the space and I'm seeing how technology is being developed at breakneck speed. But I'm also seeing how many different groups are being left out. And I bring that commitment to legacies. I want to see those equitable legacies. I want to see all groups really moving into the future as we continue to move in ways in which we can all experience the benefits. And I always say to data scientists and to my students, yes, we may be, as individual data scientists, creating products and systems and tools, but as a collective, we are creating our future. And we have got to think in that, direction. What kind of future are we building? And who are we including? And who are we excluding? So I say, wherever you are, just have that conversation and just be part of that conversation. Thank you.
I really enjoyed your presentation. Thank you. Specifically, how different cultures interpret data. I thought that was really interesting. This has been fascinating and really, really helpful in awareness. What's something actionable that I should do as a next step, or what's the next thing that we should all be trying to learn about so that we can help move this forward also?
Thank you again. I think the next step, as I said, is just getting involved. If it is that you take a data science class or a data ethics class, or you create a conversation, or you just get involved in the conversation or ensure the conversation is happening wherever you are, and that's what's important. Most universities are now doing data ethics and AI ethics. There are so many frameworks that are out there. The challenge is there's not that commitment. We see that, big tech, they have actually unveiled and deployed some of the prettiest and most glamorous ethical and AI frameworks. Whether or not they adhere to it, probably not. We've seen the ethical window dressing and the ethics washing and just decorating those windows with ethics while doing things that are unethical. But just saying, this is my data and I need to know what's happening with it. You may never own it. You may never be able to monetize it. But you can surely make a decision the way it's being used collectively to build our future.
Great presentation, thank you. So we just went through an election, and you mentioned the AI Bill of Rights, which I haven't reviewed. I don't know exactly what's in it. So you also mentioned the fact that you come from a criminology background. So is there an accountability requirement, or should there be one for candidates for any office to say where their position is, on what tools would they use, how much AI would they use, would not use? Is that part of the AI Bill of Rights, or is that...
It's not, but it's an excellent suggestion and a great recommendation that we could make, because it's important. It's important, but what we have realized is many of our elected officials really don't understand data science and algorithms and the ways in which technologies are being deployed. The good thing is that a few weeks ago, if not a few months ago, Stanford University created a program designed specifically for legislators, persons in Congress, the House, to really upskill them in real time, because they have to make the decisions, but the challenge is technology is always way ahead of our legislators. So when they sit in the room with the technologists and the CEOs of these big tech companies and data scientists, they're not engaging at the same level. So it really is about that upskilling in real time. So it's a fantastic recommendation, and I think it's one that could definitely take us in the right direction. Thank you.
Yeah. Hi, thank you for your presentation. I really enjoyed it. And I'm a data science student, and I wanted to ask if, so we found out that the AI and the technologies are flawed, right? So I was wondering, are there still places where these systems are still being used to make decisions, and how is the bridge being, is the gap being bridged between people that, say you said the politicians, the people in the academia for data science, and the people in the software engineering industry or tech. So how are we bridging the gap between, also we have a flawed technology here, are we still using it, or rather how are we making sure that the data scientists that are coming out, or we learned about data ethics in a very small segment of class in a profession, like in an ethics class, but we don't. I don't see like if other universities have incorporated this in their, say, in software development. Software developers especially, they don't care about ethics so much. So I was wondering, how is this gap being bridged with all those stakeholders, and also how are these flawed technologies still being used, and how the people that have been affected, how has that been mitigated? Thank you.
So I will say that our data sets are flawed because we are flawed. And our data sets are a representation of who we are and our society. So what we have seen would be those inequities and inequalities and systemic challenges baked into our data sets. We have seen some communities and organizations and data scientists coming up with technical tools to debias the data. But we're seeing that's not enough, because we've got to debias our thinking most of the time as technologists and designers as we build these technologies. What we're also seeing is this requirement for ethical data scientists. And we're seeing that becoming part of compliance at many organizations. They want ethical data scientists. Because what they're also realizing is, yes, we have got to protect those rights and we've got to ensure we minimize those risks. But I think what many organizations are realizing is the cost of those risks. You know, a media attack, an expose, regulators are now breathing down your back. Of course, financial damage, all of these are ethical risks. So most universities, if not all universities who are doing data science, are putting that element in there. I mean, I teach big data ethics and AI ethics, and I'm bringing that kind of knowledge to our data scientists. Because when you think about diversity, and when you think about inclusion and justice and understanding those traumatic memories, and just understanding, just drilling deeper into the data sets, what you are doing is stretching your own imagination as a data scientist. And it means that you are now bringing a more critical thinking to the creative process. So it makes you a sharper data scientist. And it also makes you less of a liability for an organization once you start to work within that compliance framework. So it's being demanded. It's being demanded, and you find many data scientists who have graduated with master's degrees and even PhDs are now thinking about, am I doing this ethically? Is there something else I need to do, another certification, to ensure that I understand questions around accountability and questions around transparency? And the fact that if we are building these algorithms and we're using and designing these black boxes, that question of opacity of the black box undermining full transparency. So there's so many questions, you know, trade secret, proprietary rights, there are things that we are thinking about from all different, you know, areas. And one of the things that we've also got to encourage is that interdisciplinary imagination. Because the more and more disciplines we have intersecting with data science and AI, it means that we have an opportunity to build something that's truly inclusive at the same time. So thank you for that question.
Thank you for the presentation. It was very interesting. I have a couple of questions about data health. So one way that you talk about data health is that the biases are informing the existing data sets that need to be cleaned up. So the first question is, so if you're going to clean it up, isn't that a human action to clean up the data set? And wouldn't that have human biases? You know, like I'm trying to think of like what's the most democratic way to clean up the data set so that it removes as many biases as possible. And then a second related question is, and I can't remember the phrase that she used, but I listened to a talk by Amy Webb from the Future Today Institute that talked about digital IDs, where it was, you know, to create digital thumbprints for each individual so that that data set, because right now our data set is, you know, Amazon has one, eBay has one, Spotify has one, Netflix has one, and they're not connected. And I think what this woman was saying is that in the future there will be a digital ID that can be really, you know, associated with the one human being. And I wanted to know from your point of view in data justice, would that be a good thing, or would that be even easier to weaponize and harm people?
Thank you for those fantastic questions. So I will say this. The one thing we know about AI is that we don't know about AI, and that's the challenge. So we can come up with all different types of approaches and solutions, but until they're deployed, do we truly understand the kind of impact it will have? So anything can sound like a good idea until that good idea comes or intersects with the community, with society. And that's why we need to always think about those long-term impacts. When it comes to the data sets, bias in data science is sometimes good and sometimes challenging. That's what bias is about. But what we need is that critical data science perspective that brings the requisite level of consciousness to know that we have got to be ethically vigilant, to know that we've got to be diligent in the ways in which we are using data science. So yes, we can do the human in the loop, and the human in the loop is great. But sometimes the loop is too big for the human. And sometimes the tech companies are creating loops and running those loops all around us. So it really is about that knowledge and that understanding, and really also includes just an approach to the ways in which we are doing data that allows us to understand the limitations as well. So we may need more disclaimers. There are some data scientists and technologists and philosophers who say it's time for maybe a Hippocratic oath to the ways in which we're doing data science. Or as we have nutritional labels, we need to have data labels that outlines how we are using the data, or just different ways in which we understand the information that's being used. The challenge is that these are all great questions, and because it is still so new, it is important for all of us to be in the discussion, because we don't have the answers, but certainly by creating a space for us to have these conversations and to have these kinds of conversations, it means that whatever the solution is we come up with, it's definitely going to be one that's inclusive and diverse. So fantastic questions. I will not have all the answers because it is so new and it's happening in real time. But I'm certainly a part of the conversation. And I think that's what we all need to do, just get involved in that conversation. Because not until it's deployed do we really understand the impacts of AI and algorithms. Because we still don't understand, and many computer scientists are yet to truly understand or able to explain why these algorithms are making the kinds of decisions that they are making. And an easy way not to explain it is to say intellectual property rights, trade secrets, proprietary rights, because we still do not understand what's happening in that black box. And it is the opacity of that black box that really undermines true explainability and true accountability and true transparency. So there are so many challenges, but it's an amazing technology. It's a technology that's transformative. It's a technology that can help us build an extraordinary future, but we've just got to use it wisely and cautiously and, of course, ethically. So thank you.
Thank you for your conversation tonight. So I'm curious, in lieu of a better system that hasn't happened yet, banks and loan companies, when somebody's going to buy a house, I know that a big problem, and we had this here in Michigan with a local bank, are discriminations against people of different genders and of different races. Would it just be easier for banks and loan companies to simply omit those data points and just remove the box to check as to whether or not somebody can get a loan or the size of a loan simply based on their race or their gender? Would that just be better just to remove that question altogether, or until we can come up with a better system of calculation, or should it stay the same and we should just stay the course and try to make something better in the long run?
Thank you, fantastic question. I would say give everyone a house, but I'm not a banker, right? Everyone deserves a house. These are the questions that we're trying to deal with. So when I work a lot in the C-suite, and I have lots of conversations with individuals in finance and credit, and these are some of the conversations they're having. How do we do this? We want to use these algorithms to personalize our services, but as we personalize, we realize we're excluding. And this is why data science needs all of us in that conversation, because at the moment they've not come up with the solution. But these are the questions that we need to ask, and these are the questions we need to have, because banks are part of the community. They are stakeholders. They are not lords unto themselves. and they need to address the concern. So they need to take a deeper look, a more intimate look at the data in their communities, the communities that are supporting them, and understand that they need to provide services that are equitable. So it's really conversations that need to have. So maybe the next conversation would be bringing all the banks together, the credit unions, the financial institutions, and find out, how are you doing data ethically? Definitely, given the extraordinary amount of data that's being collected, and that's why I said it's so challenging. Exactly, because of those proxies, and that's why we need to have those conversations, because it means that that data is not serving the community. If people are going in there to get a loan, to get a house, it's about those legacies. And if you want to build up your community, you've got to understand your data in obviously different ways. So you need to have a more creative approach to the ways in which you're using data. So financial institutions have got to be accountable to the communities that they serve.
First question is, I recently talked to a user experience person from, I think, Meta, and he was telling us how AI is profiling people without them having to enter any information. So my first question is, what's the safest way to not be profiled by AI?
There is no safe way to not be profiled by AI. That's the challenge with this technology. There is no safe way. We are being profiled. Once we are using technology, we are being profiled. Those data points are being collected and profiles are being designed, and those profiles are being used to make particular decisions. The minute that I started to do data science and data activism and work as an AI ethicist, I lost all my Facebook friends. They all disappeared from my timeline. And only neuroscience and AI, and that's it, they all disappeared. I just lost total contact with all the things that was happening in my small community. So you really don't have a way. The best way is that you can protect yourself, and you could understand how you're being profiled, and you could understand the implications of that, and you could understand your rights when it comes to data, and you could understand that you need to be aware, and you could also educate persons in your community. So there's no way not to be profiled, but you can certainly be more diligent, and you could be more situationally aware of how you are being profiled.
Okay. My second question is, I might have missed it, but is there an exact number of how many times AI has falsely incriminated people, and what is being done with these numbers?
Well, there's no exact number, because most people who've been the victim of an algorithm probably don't know. There are several individuals who realized in the criminal justice system that they were being denied parole, and a few of them decided to take those vendors to court. In court, the question became proprietary rights and trade secrets, meaning we can't tell you what's in our algorithm, versus human rights. And what we're saying is, if we're deploying these technologies and these risk assessment tools in the criminal justice system where it's about life and liberty, it could also be about death. We have got to bring a very ethical perspective. We've also got to educate criminal justice practitioners. We've also got to educate individuals who are procuring technology, because many of the individuals who are procuring these technologies in the criminal justice system, the educational system, in many of our systems, still don't understand the kinds of implications these technologies can deploy and the kinds of consequences. So it's really a broad-based approach that really brings, awareness and education and literacy to the ways in which we're doing it. So at so many different levels, we're finding challenges, but there is no full number, and I think we are kind of afraid to find out what that number is, because those are lawsuits I think many people are not expecting and would not want.
All right, my final question is, you said educate people about AI, right? AI is fairly new, so how long do you think it's going to take to educate enough people to make a real difference?
Well, it's going to take a while because the technology is changing as it's being developed as well, but we've got to start the process because we now communicate in data. We now communicate with algorithms. And if we're using this as a form of communication, we need the requisite level of literacy. So data literacy, AI literacy, futures literacy is also critical because what we're using technology to do is design futures. And we have got to understand how this technology, how data, how AI, not only changing the ways in which we communicate, but also deciding who communicates with who and who's going to benefit from a particular type of communication, or who's not going to benefit. So it really is very critical for us to start to have those conversations and for us to start to educate from, kindergarten, go right up, even speaking about AI ethics. Because this is the language. This is who we are.
I have a question. How to overcome political oppression, specifically in organization, how to overcome kind of this culture of silence, culture of ignorance, culture of conservatism, when you try to, culture of disengagement, how to overcome those kind of challenges when you work in organizations, and for example, try to deliver evidence-based data, and you don't have this kind of your voice heard in upper level administration when there is a hierarchy between lower and upper level, and you kind of in a low level of administration, and you try to to speak, and there is a very rough dialogue. How to overcome this kind of when you speak about delivering data and justice. I just personally have this kind of challenge to overcome those challenges in internal organizational level. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and an excellent question. And what we hope is that organizations will develop an ethical culture when it comes to data and algorithms and AI. And some organizations are doing it, and some organizations are challenged. Now, depending on where you are in that organization, you may have more of a voice to really, voice these types of concerns. Now, I'm not going to tell you to just go in there and charge into the boardroom and tell them they're doing it unethically, because you may not want to take that chance. But if you get the opportunity to be part of a design team, one, you can bring that knowledge that you have about ethical AI and ethical data science into the space, or even at the level of a new employee. When we have those conversations with HR, when we have those conversations with our managers, you can say that that's something that you want for professional development. Why don't we include an ethical approach to the ways in which we're doing data science, or the ways in which we're doing evidence-based research, or designing evidence-based strategies, saying that that could assist in making us, more effective and more efficient professionals. So you can ask for it for part of professional development, or you can just, ask the organization, to expose your team to that. As I said, I would not, advise anyone to just go into the company in the morning and say, hey, we're doing this unethically, we need to do it differently. Of course, there's whistleblower protection. I'm not going to tell you to blow the whistle either. But what I'm saying to you is that, they're trying to develop whistleblower protection in tech and legislate that as well to ensure that tech workers have a voice. There are some people who've decided and who've done it, and who've done it, in a very brave way, very heroic way. But the main thing is that organizations are waking up to the fact that we need to do technology ethically, and they're waking up to the fact that we need to bring all employees into that conversation, not only the data scientists and the designers and the system thinkers, but everyone, from the C-suite to Main Street. That conversation needs to happen. So thank you for that question.
So I wanted to kind of drill down a little bit in the example you gave on the parole. And as a statistician, we would kind of cringe at a single number and not having a type of uncertainty measurement that goes with it. I'm sure that you know the language I'm speaking. And I also wonder, sort of with AI, you're taking large sets of data and you're making a prediction, and usually those predictions might be fairly accurate for a large group that has those characteristics, but then you're applying them to an individual. And I think we probably all know that individuals vary a lot more than group averages vary. So I wondered, is there, in the discussion of algorithms and algorithmic rights, is that discussion part of it? Sort of the there's uncertainty with these algorithms and we need a measurement of uncertainty as well?
Fantastic question. And of course, I'll say this, the conversations are happening. They happen in particular in the School of Data Science at the University of Virginia, because my Dean of Academic Affairs and Faculty is a statistician, Jeffrey Bloom, and it's a conversation he likes us to have all the time. The challenge is this, it's really about bringing an ethical perspective. It's understanding how we do the computation, how we do the science, how we do the math. It's also understanding that this is still so new and still so opaque, but really ensuring that our statisticians who are assisting us in the ways in which we design and deploy these algorithms also understand concepts such as data trauma and why we need a justice-oriented approach and social justice, oftentimes conversations that statisticians don't like to have. So it's all of us having these uncomfortable conversations to ensure that we do this technology right. So the social justice experts and the statisticians, if they come together at that table, I do believe we will have the kind of inclusive, ethical, and responsible, trustworthy technology that we deserve.
What are some pitfalls? Like we all know, any reasonable person knows that a really bad data set, like, for example, the redline housing maps, that's an obvious example. No reasonable person would say that that was good data. But most of the time, bad things get done by good people with good intentions. What are some pitfalls that you see in big data sets that are seemingly innocuous but cause trouble? I'm guessing you see some pretty interesting examples of good ideas gone horribly awry. How might people see that kind of thing coming? Have you got any insight on that?
Well, I don't have as much insight as you are asking me now, but I will say this to you. It's again, really about the ethical vigilance and being diligent, bringing that, really sophisticated level of due diligence. And it's about your thinking. And it's one of the reasons that I encourage this, interdisciplinary imagination, because the more spaces and places that we've been, the more of an understanding we bring to the space. So oftentimes, if I'm working with other data scientists and we're thinking about ways in which we can do data science better, I'm bringing that knowledge. One of the things that I always say, in particular when it comes to AI and algorithms, they don't have lived experience. They don't have emotional intelligence. They require us to be a part of that process for them to make the kinds of decisions. And I always say that we don't ever want to get to that place where we will need an algorithm to teach us what it means to be human again. So what we need to do is bring that understanding, that thinking, that consciousness to design space, to the deployment space, to the ways in which we're adopting. Because we're never going to get the perfect data set. We are never going to get that. But what we can get would be individuals who are designing responsibly, who understand, the kind of knowledge, additional knowledge, supportive knowledge that's required, but also understanding the limitations of the technology and why we need those disclaimers, why we need to educate people on what this technology can do and what it cannot do, what this data set is representative of and what it's not representative of. So it's really, as I would say, there is no perfect answer, no perfect data set. There is never going to be a perfect algorithm. What there could be is the fact that we've had all the conversation we need to have around this, and we are going to try to build this thing as inclusive and ethical as we can. And if we falter, we're going to take responsibility for that.
I was just wondering if you could give us an example from your extensive work in communities of just someone or some entity who's actually doing something, stopping some practice, right, to disrupt, right, this data injustice, as you point out. Can you think of a concrete example just to
Sure.
close this out with?
Fantastic. And there's actually a documentary out, Coded Bias, that features Dr. Joy Buolamwini and, of course, Kathy O'Neill, who wrote Weapons of Math Destruction, and Dr. Safia Noble is also in it, and she wrote Algorithms of Oppression, as well as Meredith Broussard, who wrote the book Artificial Intelligence. And they're all in that fantastic documentary. And, of course, there are these tenets who came together as activists living in an apartment building in Brooklyn, New York, who decided that they were not going to let their landlords deploy facial recognition against them. And they came together as a group, as social activists. They worked together with Dr. Joy Buolamwini and other data activists and AI ethicists and data scientists, and they dealt with that situation in court. And they realized that as a community, we were not going to accept this because this technology was discriminating, was criminalizing and victimizing us. And as residents living in this apartment building, we were not going to accept that. So that's one community. There are other communities, our indigenous communities, that are coming up with so many different ways to ensure that we get data governance right, and we get data stewardship right, and we get data protection right. And I think all over there are groups that are coming together in Detroit, in Minneapolis. There are so many groups that have come together, activists and individuals working in the local government space to ban things like facial recognition. And more we're seeing those coalitions and coming together in ways in which we can get this thing right, because that's what we've got to do. So we understand the extraordinary benefits, and I am all for the benefits. I'm all for using technology. I'm also designing approaches to criminal justice using virtual reality to bring more equity in that space. But while I'm committed to being part of the design process, I just want to see those equitable, reliable, resilient, and sustainable legacies being created at the same time.
Many, many thanks.
Thank you
Renée,
so much.
for your time.